Hi, Lou Pulsifer here to talk about guarantees in game contracts. For example, a guarantee of creative control. A recent game designer survey conducted by Cardboard Edison showed that 27% of designers get some form of creative control guaranteed in their contract. When I read this, I said, guaranteed? What does that mean? If the publisher and designer disagreed, what happened? Or what happened if the publisher simply ignored this clause? Now, to consider that, let's talk about contracts in general. I'm not a lawyer, but I've been involved with contracts, and I can give you my notion of why they exist. They exist to make sure the parties understand each other, and possibly to help sort things out when they didn't understand each other. But that effect is limited. Practically speaking, in many respects, when you license a game or a work of fiction or something else of that sort to a publisher, it's their game or work of fiction once you've signed the contract, not yours. If you ever listen to fiction authors talk about that, they say outright, once they sign the contract, it's their book. Now, if a publisher fails to honor the contract in some subsidiary way, rather than just not publishing at all, are you going to sue them? Theoretically, you can go to court. You can try to stop sales, but by then much of the print run may be out the door. It may have already been sold. And the lawsuit will certainly cost more than the royalties that game or book is likely to earn, unless you're in a very unusual position. You can sue for some kind of damages, but I think you're much more likely to get some damages if there's a clear-cut statement in the contract of what those damages are. Moreover, lawsuits take a very long time, which is a failure of the legal system, at least in the United States. A friend of mine, his father, worked in a government job where he was susceptible to the shenanigans of patronism, and twice he was fired for shady reasons, and so he sued both times. When he finally won one of the suits 8 or 9 years later, he got 1 year's salary plus his legal costs. At that point, his legal costs were more than that salary. At that point, he gave up on the other suit. It just wasn't worth the trouble. That's an anecdote, but that's what lawsuits are like. The only way you can get a lawsuit done quickly, if you can at all, is to have a lot of money, vast sums of money. How long can you wait for a lawsuit? Now, what's a guarantee? I laugh when I hear car ads and so on where they guarantee this or guarantee that, because there's no consequence if they fail. They just say, oh, I'm sorry. If there's no consequence when a guarantee fails, quote unquote, and that consequence codified in a contract, then the guarantee is meaningless, because there's no incentive for those people to follow through on a guarantee if they have reasons not to. In the specific case of some form of creative control for a game, ask yourself what happens if the publisher prints and sells the game without providing the creative control you sought. Even if your contract is cut and dry specific about the creative control and the monetary consequences, you're going to have to spend a lot of money with a great deal of risk in a court. Meanwhile, you probably won't get the royalties you're entitled to, or at least not until the suit works itself out. And even if the contract is quite clear about the consequences, how do you define creative control? That's a really slippery term. Very few publishers are going to give you carte blanche, go, no go, over the publication of your game. They're not going to say, yes, you can look at what we have, and if you don't like it, you can stop publication. That's too risky for them. They don't need to do that. They can find people who won't require them to do that. So definition becomes necessary, but the definition is difficult. You can say something like, cannot make substantial changes in the game, but even that's open to interpretation. What's substantial? It's going to mean different things to different people. Let me tell you a story from my own experience about Britannia. I contracted with Fantasy Flight Games for the second edition of Britannia, and they had a standard derivatives clause that worried me, that essentially said they owned all the derivatives. You know, and derivatives can be t-shirts and movies and so on, and they initially offered me a clause where they got 75% of the derivative and I got 25%. Well, I negotiated that to change. But I was worried that they would prevent me, or try to prevent me, from getting other Britannia-like games published. Now, from a legal point of view, a copyright point of view, there's no question. You can't copyright ideas. Somebody could design a game that worked exactly like Britannia, but if they redo the art and redo the rules, there's not a thing I can do about it. I specifically negotiated to add to that derivatives clause that Fantasy Flight Games had no control over games derived from Britannia's method that I might license. Nonetheless, at least 2 people at Fantasy Flight Games told other people after the game was published, and they told me that Fantasy Flight Games owned the system and that no one could publish a Britannia-like game. And again, in copyright law, that's bull. It does not protect game ideas. It's impossible to own a game system, but that's what they told people. So, what could I do? Well, I thought long and hard about declaring them in violation of contract because I was really angry. But what would it have gained me in the end? When the game Italia was published by Phalanx, Fantasy Flight Games didn't do a thing that I know of, just as I expected. They were just trying to discourage competition by making untrue statements, but couldn't do anything when it actually occurred, when somebody published a Britannia-like game. Yet they violated the contract by making those statements. And it must be said that at the time, Fantasy Flight Games had a very high opinion of itself, so to speak, so authors were dirt, more or less. And that, whether that's still true, I don't know. So, what's the alternative? The alternative is to try to establish trust between you and the publisher, and this is not easy. Try to get to know your publisher very well so that you can believe that when they do something or say something, they'll follow through. Otherwise, many of the clauses in that game contract are practically meaningless because it's impractical for you to sue. Trust means meeting them face to face, which may not be practical. For example, I've never spoken to the founder of Fantasy Flight Games, let alone met him. We did all the negotiations via email between Minnesota and North Carolina. Perhaps if I'd been able to meet him, the problem I described would not have occurred. Who knows? Go to game conventions and meet these people. In sum, there are 2 aspects to contracts. The first helps both parties understand their intentions, and the second provides the basis for lawsuits. If number 2 is impractical because the lawsuit's going to cost way too much, which is usually true in games, not always, then you have to focus on number 1. So you need to try to get to know the publisher well enough to provide some security, though sometimes even that will not work. Many people have had friends who have done things that they just didn't believe the friend would do. The same thing can happen.